A lot of people like to make John C. Calhoun's positive good speech out to be something revolutionary and something that he can take credit for, but what Calhoun said on that was nothing really original with him. He was merely repeating a common belief that was held by many people.
You're right that John C. Calhoun's positive good speech was not a new or original idea. The idea that slavery was a positive good for both slave and master was a common belief among many pro-slavery advocates in the South. In fact, many slaveholders argued that their slaves were better off than free laborers in the North, who were subjected to harsh working conditions and poverty. Calhoun himself was not the first to articulate the positive good argument. The idea can be traced back to at least the early 19th century, when some slaveholders and their supporters began to argue that slavery was a necessary institution for the economic and social well-being of the South. However, Calhoun's speech is notable because he was a prominent political figure, and his defense of slavery as a positive good was seen as a direct challenge to the growing abolitionist movement in the North. It's important to note, however, that Calhoun's defense of slavery as a positive good was widely criticized by many in the North and even some in the South. The idea that slavery was a moral good was increasingly seen as indefensible as the abolitionist movement gained momentum in the mid-19th century.
Calhoun's positive good speech was also not talking about slavery in the abstract, but how slavery was being practiced in the South at the time, so he wasn't saying that slavery is strictly always a positive good for everyone involved.
That's correct. Calhoun's positive good speech was not a philosophical argument for the morality of slavery, but rather an attempt to justify the continuation of slavery in the South as a necessary evil for the economic and social well-being of both whites and blacks. He argued that slavery was a positive good because it was a necessary condition for the development of a civilized society, and that the paternalistic relationship between masters and slaves ensured that the latter were properly cared for and provided for. However, as you noted, Calhoun's argument was specific to the way slavery was being practiced in the South at that time, and did not necessarily apply to slavery in other times and places.
What people don't realize is that even with slaves with masters that were not abusive, and the like slaves were well aware whatever generosity the master shown could be gone in a second, which created instability.
Yes, that's true. Even with masters who were not abusive or cruel, slaves were constantly at risk of losing whatever privileges or freedoms they may have been granted by their masters. This created a sense of instability and uncertainty, and the fact that slaves were at the mercy of their masters could lead to feelings of helplessness and hopelessness. Slaves were always aware that their status as property made them vulnerable to being sold, separated from their families, or subjected to harsher treatment at any time. This lack of security and control over their own lives was a fundamental aspect of the dehumanizing nature of slavery.
People often also don't realize is that masters that didn't separate blacks from their families weren't necessarily good masters. Often masters would allow blacks to stay with their family as a bit of an incentive to not run away. A slave in their mind would be less likely to run away if that meant leaving his family behind.
That's a good point. While it is true that some masters allowed enslaved people to live with their families, it was not out of kindness or compassion. It was a strategic decision to maintain control and prevent rebellion or escape attempts. Separating families was a common tactic used by slaveholders to assert dominance and control over enslaved people. By allowing families to remain together, slaveholders could create a false sense of security and loyalty among enslaved people. This was just another way that slavery dehumanized and exploited people.
It was more to prevent slaves from running away. A male slave is less inclined to leave his family behind and or risk one of them getting caught if they choose to run away together.
Yes, that's correct. Allowing enslaved individuals to stay with their families was often done as a way to discourage them from running away. If a slave ran away, they risked leaving their loved ones behind, which would not only be emotionally difficult but could also potentially lead to punishment for their family members. By allowing families to stay together, slave owners hoped to create a sense of attachment and loyalty that would prevent enslaved individuals from attempting to escape. However, this did not change the fundamental fact that enslaved people were still denied their freedom and were subject to the will of their owners.
The paper The Slave Family by Stephen Crawford seems to suggest that 2/3 of ex-slaves grew up on a plantation with their mom and father. That means 1/3 didn't.
Yes, that's correct. In his paper, The Slave Family, Some Methodological Considerations and Results, Stephen Crawford analyzed data from the WPA slave narratives, which were collected in the 1930s from former slaves who were still alive at that time. Crawford found that approximately 2/3 of the ex-slaves he studied reported growing up in a household with both their mother and father. However, it's important to note that these numbers may not be fully representative of the entire slave population, as they are based on self-reported memories from former slaves many years after their enslavement. Additionally, the experiences of slaves varied widely depending on factors such as geography, the type of labor they were forced to perform, and the attitudes and practices of their individual masters.
It would be expected, though, for former slaves to remember if they were brought up by a mom and father, although one could expect the specifics of the family relationship might be blurry.
Yes, that's a good point. Memory can be fallible, especially if it has been a long time since the events being remembered took place. However, in the case of former slaves who were raised by both parents, it is likely that this would have been a significant part of their experience in family history, and thus more likely to be remembered accurately.
Like it would be expected that they wouldn't be able to remember specifics about their family life, but not the overall structure of it.
Yes, it is likely that former slaves would have some memories of their family structure, even if they couldn't remember all the specific details. However, it's important to keep in mind that the memories and experiences of former slaves could vary widely, and that their accounts may not always be reliable due to the trauma and abuse they endured, as well as potential gaps in their education and language barriers. Additionally, it's possible that some former slaves may have adapted their stories to fit expectations or to gain sympathy from their listeners. Therefore, historians must take a critical and nuanced approach to analyzing the testimonies of former slaves.
Well, 1/3 is still a lot of non-intact families.
Yes, that is true. The fact that 1/3 of ex-slaves did not grow up with both parents on the plantation suggests that family separation was still a significant issue during slavery, even if the majority did grow up with both parents.
Often when people think of family separation in the context of slaves, they think of parents, but researchers often go beyond that to include any immediate family. When you do that, you can get into higher percentages.
Yes, that is a good point. Family separation among enslaved people can take many forms beyond just separating parents and children, such as separating siblings, grandparents, aunts and uncles, and other close family members. It is important to take a broad view of family separation in this context in order to fully understand its impact on enslaved people and their communities.
It is also wise to note that many slave owners didn't have sex with their slaves not because they thought that could be rape or whatever, but because they felt it would be like having sex with a barn animal.
While it is true that some slave owners refrained from having sexual relations with their slaves out of a sense of moral or ethical concerns, the vast majority of slave owners did engage in sexual relations with their slaves, including rape and sexual abuse. In fact, sexual exploitation and abuse were common features of slavery in the United States, and enslaved women were often subjected to sexual violence by their masters or other white men in positions of power. This exploitation was not only a result of the power dynamics inherent in the institution of slavery, but also a reflection of the racist and sexist attitudes prevalent in American society at the time.
Wouldn't the vast majority of slave owners having sex with their slaves contradict their beliefs in having a pure white race?
There were certainly some slave owners who believed in having a pure white race and did not engage in sexual relationships with their slaves, but it is also true that many slave owners did have sexual relationships with their slaves. The two are not necessarily mutually exclusive. In fact, some slave owners believed that having sexual relationships with their slaves was a way to increase the number of slaves they owned, as any children resulting from the relationship would be born into slavery. Additionally, there were many slave owners who saw their slaves as property rather than people, and thus did not view sexual relationships with them as immoral or inappropriate. It is also important to note that the concept of race and racial purity was not as well defined in the 18th and 19th centuries as it is today. The idea of a pure white race is a relatively modern construct and would not necessarily have been a central concern for all slave owners in the past.